All right, we don't have the readings. We'd like the readers to come back up. Ken? For those joining us online or recorded, there were no readings today because I forgot to hit record. But the sermon is still recorded. Let's take a look at this passage. In the lectionary text, there were some great verses. Psalm 23 is obviously a winner. You can always preach on that. The Acts one, I think, is great, but I kind of stayed away from Acts just because I like to preach in Acts after Pentecost. I just think there's an appropriateness to that. And John actually is a great passage. It reveals some things. It talks about some things that relate to us, the lost shepherd, the sheep. It goes along with Psalm. You'll hear some of those hints of things here, that sense of sacrifice. But because we've been in this book of John over the past few weeks and our minds are still hovering around this idea of this Johannine epistle being given to a Johannine community around that turn of that first century. And there's this sense of false teachers speaking into the lives of that community. And John, or the writer of this epistle, is trying to shape the community in such a way that they can resist the presumption of lack of sin and lack of love coming from these false prophets. And we see here already into the heart, into the center of this epistle, John is writing again in that same vein, dealing with issues of how we relate to one another and how we love God. And he stays true to those themes in this passage today. So let's dig it apart. And if I didn't put a sermon title, sometimes if nothing clever comes up, I just let it go and don't worry about it. But I guess, and it's not fun or clever, but it's abiding love. I guess if I were to sort of take some themes from today, what does it mean to have abiding love in us? And I think that this passage is actually quite profound. And I think it's profound in the sense of what it offers us, both in the first verse and in the final verse. Now, for the first verse, if you have your Bibles with you and you're following along, it starts off, and I just want those first three words to sort of resonate in your spirit. We know love. We know love. That means John, as he was writing to this community or this church, he's saying, we as children of God know love. Now, in a world where we have Beatles saying all we need is love, and other songs that you can't buy me love, and all these conversations and topics about love, and I'm sure from Sunday school or growing up, you remember there were many different types of love. There's brotherly love, philia, there's eros, there's that sort of sexual love, and then there's agape, and there's this sense of this self-giving love and this notion of agape. And that is the love that John would have been talking about here. But it's not interesting to me, really, that he would be talking about agape love. That's kind of given. If you're going to talk about God's love, that's the type of love you're going to talk about. But what it's interesting about that is that we have a knowledge of love. And what a rare commodity that is. How many times in our lives have we experienced broken love? Self-serving love? Misappropriated love? How many times have we longed for love and not got it? Wish we had more love, wish we had different love, or better love, or stronger love, or more abiding love. And yet in this passage, John starts from the get-go just saying, we know love. We have a knowledge of it. We have an experience of it. We have a profound encounter with love that has changed us, not even just in our actions and in the way we live in this world, but our very understanding of what it means to exist as a human being. So when he starts and he says, we know love, he is making a profound statement about the Christian community. We know love. By this, and then gives us the reason why we know love, that he laid down his life for us. God's love is most demonstrated in the sacrifice that Christ Jesus made, not because he just died, not because he was put on the cross because they thought he was a blasphemer or a liar, but because he willingly obeyed the will of the Father to subject the innocence of his being and to subject it to the death and the horror and the trauma that came from that. And for those of you, a few of you, I see who were here with us on the Monday of Holy Week, and we watched the Passion of Christ, Mel Gibson's interpretation or expression of what happened in that last week of Christ's life, and it's horrendous. And sometimes we want to grab hold of that and be like, oh, the sacrifice was so gruesome. He was tortured, and torture is associated with this sense of love. And I don't even think that's where God is going. It's not even about the exact torture. It's about the fact that someone who did not deserve to die, who was blameless before God, said, I will reconcile all of humanity by giving up my life and enduring the experience of death, which was part of the curse that was given in Genesis 3 to us as human beings, that we would eat the grains of the field until we die. And John says, we know love because we know Christ. But the interesting thing about that is, he goes on, and there's a M dash, and it says, and we put those things in there, but it says, and, so we know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. Well, John just got real. Because John's not talking about serving in a soup kitchen. John's not talking about helping out, in a clothing exchange or serving and painting a house. He's not talking about a lot of the service things that we often see or conceptualize in the church. He's taking an extreme form, and it relates in that sense to finding that lost sheep, so that lost sheep in the Gospel of John that Ken read this morning can find that place by the water for stillness and rest. But John's saying, no, just as Christ laid down his physical human life and died for us, so too we are called to do that. Now, that's kind of a difficult thing. I'm sure in the time that this was written to the church, there would have been a chance that would have actually been a reality. So he's naming something that is something that those in that context would have faced. We don't really face that. And I got to say, and I think in most situations, like if we're on a shelf, road driving down around the Alpine Loop and something happened and any one of you were like, I'm slipping and falling, and I have a chance to grab a hold of you and pull you up and I die in the process, that I would have, anyone would do that. You'd see someone you help in the moment. But this is actually talking about something a little bit more complicated in the sense of it is the mentality in which we live our lives. That I am willing to give my life for the sake of your life, not because I think that I have nothing to live for, not because I think you have something grand to offer, but because I recognize that the life that we are living collectively is temporal. This is temporal. If you're here today or you're online today and you truly believe that there is an afterlife to which we are called, and that this life is temporal, and this life actually participates in the curse that we received from God in the fall, then there's a loss of value of our sense of self in this life and those things that we hold on to so dearly. Verse 17, you're like, we're only at the first verse? Good heavens. It's going to be a long sermon. No, I'll just whiz through the rest. I'll just gloss over. There's some hard stuff in here I don't want to deal with. Verse 3:17 says, how does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and yet sees a brother or sister in need and refuses to help? This is a tough passage, and I think most people do gloss over it. And in fact, as I read some commentaries, commentators sort of look over this, but you got to remember also at a time where this was the New Testament church and no one was really prospering. And so the sharing of one another's belongings amongst the Christian communities was fairly normative at the time. Now, in today's culture, that seems to be not the case, and it's a challenge. Now, what it's interesting that it's saying is anyone who has world goods, it doesn't say you can't have world goods, it doesn't say you can have a lot of world goods. It says if you have world goods and you see need and ignore it, then you are betraying the love that is meant to be in us. That's a tough one. Do we just turn our eyes and not look for those who are in need? Because if we see those who are in need and we say we don't do something for them, and I remember dealing with this myself, and I'm not saying this is a horrible example in terms of like it's not a very good example, but it was an effort. We in Louisville at some point, I was there was a message about giving, and I thought to myself, how many times I pull off the highway and there's someone there with a sign and they want money. And oftentimes I'm like, you know what, if I get, and I know the old excuse, if we give them money, they'll probably go buy alcohol or drugs or something. We kind of say we don't want to contribute to that. But at the same time, I've also said, you know what, if my life consisted of living somewhere where I didn't have security and my day consisted of holding up a sign, hoping for change, that I can survive in this world, maybe I would be drinking a lot too. Maybe I would. Because I don't know that. I'm not in their shoes. That seems like a pretty lousy life. And maybe I would be seeking to escape. And at the end of the day, it's not my problem what they do with money. It's not our problem what someone does with our service. It's not our job to dictate how our giving is used. And that also, ironically enough, falls into the idea of giving to the church. And what we do and how we give, we are called to serve, to love, to give, to meet the needs. And so in that case, what we did was I just said, let's start keeping our single dollars in our change drawer. So you're like, oh, if I need some single bills, I know where to go. I'll go hit up Jason's car. We lock our car. But the idea of I have at least a little capacity. If everyone gave that person holding the sign $1, maybe their need wouldn't be so great that day. And when I see that person and I know that $1 means absolutely nothing to me, I'll blow $1, I'll throw $1, I'll buy, it could be a kid selling lemonade stand. It could be, $1. It's this trinket costs $1 at the checkout. Sure, I'll take 2. And yet when I come to the person at the side of the highway who wants to buy a meal, I discern or judge how they might spend their money. God is saying to us through John and in this epistle, if we have worldly means and we ignore those who don't, God's love does not abide in us. Verse 18, John goes on, as he does in the previous verses that we looked at, little children, again, not pejorative, but an affectionate term. He calls us, let us love, not in word and speech from the pulpit, from our conversations to what we ought to do, but in truth and in action. And quite frankly, this is one of my biggest critiques of the church and the nation as a whole. And as a person who was raised in a bicultural, biracial home, to see denominations across our nation talk about racial reconciliation in our words and in our speech, but not see that transform beyond just projecting on a Facebook page or on our websites, says love does not actually abide in us. And I've said long and behold, in my time in the national office, to those leaders that were there, we can keep putting people of color on our brochures. That doesn't make us a diverse church, and it doesn't solve anti-racist, it doesn't solve racist issues in our culture. If we truly want to be a multicultural church that doesn't have racial division, then we need to invite someone of another skin color or ethnicity or culture to sit across the table from us every single week until that person becomes a dear friend. And in doing so, we'll begin to break down the walls and barriers that exist in our nation between different ethnic groups and cultures. Because that's putting our actions into practice. It's not what we say from a pulpit or in conversation or right on our Facebook pages. It's what we do over our dinner tables and in our living rooms. It's what we do when no one sees. 3:19, and by this we will know that we are from the truth, and will reassure our hearts before him. And I want to stop you for a second. The idea that we can participate in this sense of truth is phenomenal. Like I said last week in the movie The Matrix, there's a sense of there's truth beyond this world, and then the world as we experience it. And for those of you who are from the boomer generation or from the silent generation, I don't think anyone's in the silent generation here, but truth was a much more concrete thing 50 years ago. Truth is relative. Truth is personal. Truth is situational now. We're all wrestling. What does it mean to say something is true? Yeah, at the core, we all think there is some truth in us, and there is some truth in the world, and we like to think that maybe we've tapped into some of that truth. That truth is found in Christ Jesus, and what this passage is saying, that by this, by our truth, by our actual action, we know that we are from the truth. When we put aside our physical beings, when we put aside our worldly wealth, when we put aside our existence in this world and say, no, we are going to serve our neighbor, we're going to love our neighbor, we're going to do God's will in this world, then we actually participate in the truth. And it becomes a reality in our lives in shapes us. And as John writes, our participation in this truth will reassure our hearts before him that whenever our hearts condemn us and tell us, no, you don't have truth. No, you're wrong. No, you're failing in this. No, you didn't do enough. That God is greater than our hearts. And he knows everything. In 3:21, beloved, if our hearts do not condemn us, then we may have boldness before God. And that God has given us the Spirit, and we'll talk about that more in Pentecost, the nature of the Spirit in us and how that changes us. But we see that in that Jeremiah 31:31 passage of the New Covenant, where God says, I will write my law within your heart. That is the truth of God's being, love, and covenant with Israel. And when that law, a sense of right and wrong and love and hate, can be discerned within our spirits, and are expressed in action and in deed, then we participate, and we then have a boldness in that truth. And this is I think the hardest part of this passage is in this 22. And in fact, I just put a question mark next to it in my notes because I don't really have a clue what to do with it, quite frankly. And because we have this boldness, we receive from him whatever we ask. This is in the gospel several times. Ask and you shall receive. You receive whatever you ask. And there's a whole mentality within American, North American, Western spirituality called the prosperity gospel. That says as long as we ask, let's take our hanky and stick it here and pray over it. Let's give some ministry some seed money because it'll return multiple fold. There's this desire, but again, that motivation is self-preservation. Not giving out of truth and love for our neighbor. When we align our will with God, perhaps, that's the standard theological interpretation of any passage that says, ask whatever you want and God will do it. Well, if you align with God, then he'll do it. Well, the same thing can be true for, if you ask me something I'm already going to do, well, I'm going to do it. I don't buy that. That's actually a sloppy answer, in my opinion. Aligning your will with God. Well, I don't know what God's perfect will is. How do I align it? And honestly, anything I ask, does that mean if I ask something outside of God's will that God's still going to do it? No, it doesn't. Trust me, I've tried many times. I was testing God, give me a Porsche. Oh. I know I don't need one. No one has a Porsche here, right? No one has a Porsche. I like Porsches. I would never drive one though, because people say things about Porsche owners. I love a Porsche, but God's not going to give me one no matter how much I proclaim truth, no matter how much. And some might actually say, oh yeah, maybe you should pray more. Maybe you should have more faith. I don't think that's how it works. That's not how it works. I could pray until the moon comes, until the cows come home. It's not going to change the fact that I don't have a Porsche out front. I hope no one has a Porsche that no one has a Porsche online, right? John Rosa, you're not hiding a Porsche somewhere. Jim, you look like you might be a Porsche driver. I don't know. I'm just kidding. But he goes on. We receive from him whatever we ask. Do with that what you want. I don't really know. I know that God doesn't give us whatever we ask, but we should still live in truth and display God's love in action. But God's not going to give us whatever we want, but God's will be done, and we will see the benefits of that in this world. But going on past that tough part, but we obey his commandments and do what pleases him. And I love that because there's a sense of delight when we obey God, and you see this all through the story of the Old Testament. God and the Israelites obey, and prosperity will follow. Disobey, and calamity will follow. And that's just the story of the whole Old Testament. For those of you who've been with us in the Bible studies, we've seen this again and again to the point that it seems almost repetitive. Like, Israel, figure it out already. You keep messing up and not doing what's right, and then you get punished for it. But the times that you obey and do what God has commanded, prosperity follows and blessings follow. And we're reminded of this, that in our obedience, that God delights in us and it pleases him. And perhaps the crux of this sense of knowing love comes down into what is portrayed in these last two verses. And this is his commandment, that we should believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he has commanded us. And in this case, John is taking those first two great commandments, and he's not just saying love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, but he's actually attaching a concrete behavior to this sort of large, somewhat amorphous idea of what does it mean to love God with your heart, soul, and mind. And he's locating it in a sense of belief. If you believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and all the things that follow, the salvation follows, that the death, that his incarnation was legit, that his death procured salvation for us, that his resurrection is the body that we will carry and a promise of future existence with God. All of those things factor into this belief in the name of his Son, Jesus. And he tacks on love one another, just as he commanded us to. Verse 24, all who obey his commandments abide in him. Meaning, when we love God with our heart, soul, and mind and believe in his Son, Jesus Christ, and we love one another, and we see others in needs, and we serve those needs, and we meet those needs, and we think of others better than ourselves, and we don't hold on to the value of our life in this world, but become so spiritually and heavenly minded that we say, this is just a temporal place. We're resident aliens. What really matters is what we do in this life and how it affects our future with God. All who obey his commandments abide in him, and he abides in them. And by this we know, again, the knowledge of, that he abides in us by the Spirit that he has given us. The knowledge of God's abiding love is the very thing that motivates us to minister, to serve, to care, to love our neighbor. The abiding love is the reassurance that we are God's children, and that as we love God, that God empowers us with boldness and calls us to greater things on this earth, not for the sake of ourselves, but for the sake of God's kingdom and his love. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. And all God's children said, Amen.